additional announcement, which is you may have seen we put out a midterm evaluation, and that's just to try to get some input from you all on how are things going generally and how do you want things to change for the course. And so please fill that out. I'll post a link to it somewhere in places so that we have more visibility on it. So TLDR, there's an evaluation out now. Please fill it out if you have time. Thanks.
Thank you, Fitz. And along those lines, it sounds like someone's unmuted. Can they make sure you're muted? So in the lessons, Fitz posted a week 3 recap. Here there's a recap of last week, and also a little Google form here, a survey about how the flipped lecture format is going. It seems like based on the responses so far, about 12% of the class has submitted a response. People seem to like it. So if you feel like you're not represented in that sentiment, please do make sure you fill this out. This is really going to help us going forward because, as I said, it looks like people generally like this. So we might try to keep this format going forward. So as I said, today we're going to go over some timers. First, going to talk a little bit about JSDoc, and then we'll jump into timers. I do want to mention that this week we really start to ramp up, I would say, in the complexity of material. We're going to be going over timers today. Wednesday jumps into asynchronous programming with promises, and then Friday we're going to see a little bit more of that and probably some async await. And it's not necessarily more material. I would just say the complexity of the material might be a little bit higher than what we've seen before. So I just wanted to give you guys a heads up that that is coming this week and next week as well. Okay, so some quick announcements. CP2 is due Wednesday at 11 p.m. We will have a quiz this Friday like we did 2 weeks ago. We are very, very close to releasing the grades for quiz 1. I am just being a little slow on getting the answer key out. And so once we do that, have that set up, we will release the quiz 1 results. Is there anything else? I don't think so. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So you should have already seen for CP2 that we are requiring function comments in your JavaScript code. So this is the format for that is called JSDoc. It looks something like this. This is an example for one of the shortcut alias functions for getElementById. This is an example of what we would expect on your functions in your JavaScript code. And there's a link here to the code quality guide, which also has a link to the official JSDoc documentation. This is also in the reading as well. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about timers. Now, oftentimes in JavaScript, especially as opposed to Java or Python, we often want to delay executing code, or we want to call code repeatedly after a certain period of time. And one of the most common reasons we want to do this is for something like games, for example, or animations. You can imagine a quiz game where you want to show a timer to a user, how much time they have left to answer a question, or like a classic Tetris game where blocks move down the page. If you had a function that moved each of those blocks in the game on the page, you're not going to call it immediately. You're going to wait a certain period of time before you move those blocks or call that function to move those blocks. So implementing that delay is what we're going to be looking at today. So as I said, one of the classic examples is a timer. Maybe you want to count down from 10 all the way to 0. We know how to do that very simply with a for loop. That shouldn't be a problem. And if I just copy this code here and put this in the console. And yes, I know that is tiny. And I enter this and I actually invoke my start countdown function. You can see this does indeed count down from 10 to 0, but it does so immediately. Now, if we wanted to, say, insert a second delay between printing these out, how would we do that? Well, there are two functions in JavaScript that allow us to do this. They are setTimeout and setInterval. Now, these take a function that we want to call, and then a period of time after which we want to call that function. setTimeout only calls that function once and then never again. And setInterval repeatedly calls the function that you pass it after a period of time. So the interval for both the times that we pass in here in setTimeout and setInterval are in milliseconds. So 1 second would be 1,000. And then once we want to clear those timers, clear a timeout or clear an interval, we can use these functions, clear timeout and clear interval. Now they take something which is a timer ID. This is a number that identifies the timer that we created with setTimeout and setInterval. These are different from the IDs that we were talking about for HTML elements. Those are strings. Those are actual identifiers for HTML elements. This number that's passed back when we call setTimeout is literally a number. We'll see that. And that number actually allows us to reference our timer and clear it later on. Without that timer ID, we would not be able to remove a timer that we had created. So there are times when we don't want to keep track of our timer ID, but there are a lot of times that we do want to do that. So I'm just going to take a look at this page really quickly. And this simply has two functions. This is zoomed in. Two functions, say hello and say hello to, which are just global functions I've defined on my page, and I can call them from the console here. And you can see this. Now, if I just quickly wanted to call say hello after 2 seconds, I would pass in the name of the function say hello and pass in 2,000 milliseconds for 2 seconds. I hit enter here, and you'll see that I print out hello. Okay, the number here that got passed back, this is the ID of that identifies that specific timer that we had created. So every time I call setTimeout, I get this unique ID that I can use to then clear the timeout. Now, I don't need to clear a timeout once it's already happened. Once I've called the function, setTimeout will never call that function again. So once I already print hello, there's no point in clearing it. But if I were to do setInterval instead, and do this, say, every half a second, 500 milliseconds, you'll see here that this will just keep going until I call clear interval. So I have the ID here, and I can call clear interval and pass in the identifier that got passed back. And you'll see here that I've stopped printing out hello to the log. Now, we can also use clear timeout. Let's say if we had, I'm just going to prep it. So if I had, let's say, timeout after 5 seconds here, and then once this hits 5 seconds, it prints out. But if I wanted to prevent it from printing hello here, I could call this setTimeout. I have the identifier 5. I can pass it in, and you can see here that I'm never going to print hello because I cleared that timer before it actually called say hello there. And the only other thing I guess I can show you here perhaps is we can set our timer ID to a variable, right? So say hello every 500 milliseconds. My timer ID is now 6, and I can clear that interval by passing in timer ID. Okay, and one of the other things that we saw in this lecture was that I can actually pass in parameter values for my response function. So let's say instead of passing in say hello, I'm just going to pass in the function console log here. And after 1 second, I'm going to print out hello. And you can see here that the arguments that I pass in after the delay time are the parameters of my response function here. So where in add event listener, we had to actually use anonymous functions in order to pass parameters into our callbacks. But set timeout and set interval are much nicer in that we can actually specify the arguments that we want to pass into our response function, our callback function here. Okay, I think that's really it for lecture. I think I'm just going to go on over to the examples. Just quickly, it says lecture mentioned this parameter functionality isn't supported by IE. So what Aaron is mentioning is in the slides here, what I just talked about with passing in parameters, this doesn't work in IE 11. I'm not sure what the percentage usage of IE 11 is right now, but it's pretty darn low, and it's getting lower all the time since Edge replaced it. So I wouldn't worry about supporting IE. And in this class, we only expect you to write code to support the latest version of Chrome. So this isn't really a concern for us, but it is a good point. Okay, so if we go over into lessons and week 4, and we go to lecture 10 exercises, we're going to start off by taking a look at our Skittles again. I just can't get enough of the Skittles example. I just love it. There's always more to do. We're not going to do too much more, but one thing I did want to try doing. Oh man, let's see here. I need to switch over on my screen here. Okay, is that better? Is this chat window blocking the view? Can you guys see that at all? I can't get rid of it. Okay, I'm just going to minimize the chat window, so I'll try to look back at it. But to keep it from blocking, I'm going to minimize it. Okay. So here we go. Man, this is just not. This is okay. All right, hold on. New computer woes. Can we get rid of this? I think we're just going to have to work in this world here. So anyways, last time what we had, we hit start. We could fill the jar. We could actually make guesses here. Too low for the number of Skittles. And when we clicked reset game was the last part we didn't get to. But for the template today, I've already updated that. When we hit reset, we clear the jar. And we reset the values we had. And when I hit start, I can restart a new game. And I can just keep doing this forever, get new Skittles, new colors that are guessed here. But what this is kind of boring. I mean, the Skittles just disappear. I mean, I think it would be kind of cool if they were to sort of disappear one by one over time. So let's see if we can update our empty jar function to, instead of just immediately remove all of our Skittles, let's have each Skittle be removed after a certain period of time. the way we implemented empty jar before, there were two methods. We just wiped out the inner HTML using id jar.innerHTML equals empty string. There was another way where we did a while loop with the children of the jar element. This is a third way, which is just using query selector all to get all the elements with the Skittle class, and then just looping through the array or the node list that gets returned and calling the remove function on each Skittle. So what I want to do is I want to wait a certain period of time before calling Skittle's index I.remove. So one of the ways we can do this is with setTimeout. I can use an anonymous function here. And then I can pass in a period of time. So if I pass in a period of time, let's say 200 milliseconds here, and I come down here and reload the page, not the page I wanted to reload, but that's OK. So we still have this here. Now, if I hit start and I hit reset game, they kind of delayed a little bit. So I have my Skittles here. I hit reset, and yeah, they kind of flicker a little bit before disappearing, but it's not kind of the individual removal I was imagining, right? It's kind of just the same as I had before. So, but and why is that? What's going on here with how I've implemented it? I mean, I've given, for every single Skittle, I have a separate timeout function. So what is going on here? Well, what happens is that setTimeout gets created. A timer gets created for each Skittle, and setTimeout for each Skittle gets called immediately, basically, for all of these. So I'm creating 100 and some odd timers that get executed after 200 milliseconds. But they've all been created at the same time. So all of them call this anonymous function at almost the same time. So that's why there's just a little bit of a delay, and then all of them disappear. What I really want to do here is do an offset between each Skittle. So the first Skittle I want to remove in 20 milliseconds. The second Skittle I want to remove in 40 milliseconds. The third one I want to remove in 60. So what I could do here is I could do my index times a certain period of time. So 20 milliseconds here, maybe 50 milliseconds. And let's see what that does here. And you can see now that this is sort of the expected behavior here, where I have a 20, 50 millisecond delay. What did I put there? 50 milliseconds removal between each Skittle. And so this will happen each time. And if I start another game, I actually continue removing all of those Skittles up until I hit the new ones that I've added. So that's kind of fun. I enjoy that. It's better than them just disappearing. I'm sorry, I'm just watching it. It's quite mesmerizing. But instead of using a setTimeout, we could also use a setInterval. And that is what I would like some help with from you guys. So if we wanted to do this as a setInterval, what is one of the first things I guess we would need to? We need to remove something here. We no longer need one aspect of this code if we're going to use setInterval versus setTimeout. Can anybody? Yeah, so we don't need to loop anymore. We are going to sort of keep track of that ourselves in our setInterval. So I'm going to get rid of this loop here. And I'll also get rid of this bracket. but we still need an index. So I'm going to just define I equals 0 here. And so now we have set interval. Do I need this anymore? Do I need the I? Do I need to keep this? No, right? Because we actually don't call skittles.remove until another 50 milliseconds. So in this case, where we had to offset the timeout timers, we no longer have to do that with set interval here. We can just keep a set delay without incrementing it each time. But so let me just go ahead and run this particular example and see what happens. So I'm not really removing any skittles here. I'm removing one skittle here at index 0. So what else do I need to do after each skittle that I remove here? I need to, yeah, right. I need to keep incrementing I each time that this is called. OK, so this should work a little bit better. So let's reload this. OK, so that works. And it looks like it works. But if I open the console here, I am just spewing errors here. And this is just going to keep going forever and ever. And I am going to reload the page here to stop that. So can anybody tell me what was that error that we got there? Right? Aaron is saying we need to set a cap. And why do we need to set a cap here? One, I didn't stop the interval. That's right. And then also our I, right, is beyond the index. That's why we're getting the error, because we didn't stop the loop. The loop increments our I value. And then eventually our index is beyond the value or the length of our node list, right? And does anybody know what you actually get if you index beyond the length of an array or a node list in JavaScript? What value do you get back? So if I index, let's say, if I do this, what is my array, 5? It's actually undefined. Null, that might be a carryover from Java, but we actually get undefined. There's no error there. No error is thrown at all in the console. So the only indication we would have that there was an issue is that we tried to call remove on the undefined keyword there. So something to be aware of when you're messing or dealing with indexes in node lists and arrays. OK, so what we need to do here is we need to clear this interval at some point, right? And when do we want to clear our interval? If I is less than, we could do it greater than, I'm going to do less than here, skittles.length, then we'll call skittles I remove and increment. Else, what do we want to do here? OK, somebody said break, remove the interval. OK, so clear the timer. So I'm going to do a clear interval here. And this should work as we wanted. A lot more skittles that time. But you'll see here, what is going on? So it actually looks like we don't have any errors here, but let me add a log statement here. And you can see that even though we're out of Skittles, we are still counting this interval, right? This interval is still going. So we called clear, but as people have pointed out in the chat, we need to actually get a reference to that interval. I'm reloading here so that that timer doesn't keep printing. So if I go back here, I need to set my the return value of setInterval to some variable. So I'm going to do this let timer ID equal setInterval. And then here I'm going to pass in timer ID. And then hopefully if we reload this, I'm just going to have this open so I can see the console. And you see, we call clear interval. This got called twice because we're actually calling, from the way we implemented this before, we actually called empty jar when we filled it as well, which is unnecessary. So we could comment that out. We only want to call it when we fill the jar, or excuse me, when we reset the game here. And you can see it only gets called once because we successfully cleared our interval by passing in the timer ID. Okay, so that officially ends, I think, no promises, ends the Skittles example. I don't know if I want to keep adding more to it. We got other stuff we want to look at. Does anybody have any questions before we move over to the next example? Jeremy asks here, how do we have the timer ID if that's returned by the very function we're calling? Is that just the magic of anonymous functions? As far as I know, it is just the magic of anonymous functions here. I don't know, Fitz, if you have a good answer for why specifically that works. I just know that it is a feature of JavaScript that you can do this. And it is very, very handy.
Yeah, I think it's based on the scoping and order of when things happen here. And so the timer ID variable is defined before the setInterval function is called, which means by the time that anonymous function runs, then it's kind of within the scope of empty jar, kind of, and so it has access to those variables.
Does that help, Jeremy?
I think so.
Awesome, cool. Thank you, Fitz. Aaron says, could you use a while loop and some isEmpty functionality for the jar? You could, but one of the things here to be aware of is that node lists don't actually have the same functions as typical arrays have. So for example here, if I do I've just got so many windows here. And you can see this list here is much shorter than what we saw for our standard array. So I'm not sure if the node list has that sort of like built-in isEmpty functionality, it might be a little bit more difficult. You could make your own isEmpty by checking the length of the node list. But one of the things to be aware of is that node lists are not standard JavaScript arrays, although they're indexed just like an array would be. Lauren asked, can you use recursion in JavaScript? Are you talking about, Lauren, like you can use recursion? Do you mean with timers specifically? Yeah, so you can set timeout is one of the things that you that people often do recursively. So the example we saw before where we had the for loop and we used set timeout and we incremented the timeout, we multiplied the index by 20 milliseconds and we looped through all of our skittles. So instead of incrementing the timer within our set timeout, we could have actually called another set timeout and defined another function in there that referenced the next skittle in our node list. So you could, within a set timeout, set another set timeout, and that's a pretty common pattern, but it can get a little confusing. I mean, up to you if you want to try that. I think there's a link. There might be a link to that in the slides. I can't remember, but that is a common way of using timers. For this example, instead of keeping a counter, could we have just used the parents remove child method? So remove child, if we could have looped, if we had looped over, we would still need to pass in each of the children that were in the parent. So we would still need to know how many children the parent had and loop over that number and call the parents remove child method. So we could have done that. But we would have needed a loop of some kind. There's ways to implement this with features of both, using a children and a while loop, and also using a node list with QSA. So you can implement a lot of this functionality in multiple ways. If we did set timeout recursively, potentially not. I think we could do something like you could do something like set timeout. This is, I don't think this would work here, but if I were to do set timeout, and I'm gonna get rid of a lot of this functionality here, we would, right? So I would do skittles dot remove here, and then what I would want to do is another set timeout, passing in another, maybe something like this. And this might work. I'm not 100% positive if this is going to work right now, so please bear with me. So we're off on something there. I'm not sure, but this is sort of the idea of what you would want to do if you wanted to use set timeout recursively. I can look at this again and see how we would do this and update the code. But right now, let's get onto the next example here. I'll answer one more question. Since we are removing children, wouldn't the 0th child change? So why aren't we repeatedly removing the 0th child? This seems like it should fail and remove every other child, but it doesn't. So I'm just gonna go back to what we had, the working example. And let me reload this again just to show that it still works. And I've done something horribly wrong. Okay. Okay, great. So Jeremy, the reason that we don't need to keep removing the 0th child is because we're no longer using the children property. We're not, the children property of an element is actually an HTML collection, which is what is known as a live collection, or it's a live list, which means its length and contents are updated in real time. So as we were previously removing the children of a parent and using the children property, that children HTML collection was actually shrinking as we were looping. The QSA, the query selector all, actually returns what is a node list, and this behaves much more like a typical array, like we would expect. So even though I'm removing Skittles from the parent, the node list that query selector all returns still has the same length, and it still has the same reference to all of the Skittles in the jar. So its length never changes, and we still have to loop over each element in that node list individually to remove it. The children array, again, that HTML collection was constantly shrinking, and the element that was referred to by the 0th index was changing. Yes, exactly. So if we update the DOM, that children HTML collection updates in real time. So I would suggest, if you're confused about this, I'm sure other people are, just as one of the things to be careful of when you're using the children property of an element, to know that that array or list updates in real time, whereas query selector all returns a node list that doesn't update in real time. You can look up HTML collections. Some of the previous lecture examples included links to that. So if you're interested, you can read a little bit more about that. Okay. Let us go over to this next example. This is an auto typer, and I'll show you here what this does. If I type in some text, hello, CSE154, if I hit start here, this actually just prints out my text here and just keeps repeatedly doing this until I hit start again. When I hit start, it stops. If I hit start again, it continues from where I was before. And if I hit reset, everything gets back to its initial state here. We've cleared the timers. We've emptied out the text box here. So we want to go ahead and implement this functionality ourselves here. So if you go to the auto typer, you should have this template here available for you. And we're going to go through here and implement some of the behavior, or actually all of the behavior of this example. Okay, so just looking at the HTML really quickly, we have a button here with the ID Animate button. This is the start button. Then we have a second one, the reset button, with the ID of reset button. We have our input here, where the user puts in what they want to be automatically typed. And that has an ID of input text. And then we have the message, or what we were outputting, into a paragraph tag here with an ID of output. So the first thing we want to do is take a first stab at this animate text function. So when we click start, we click the animate button, we want the text that's in the text box to start character by character printing out to that output paragraph tag here. So once again, I just want to show you what that looks like here. When I hit start, this is the animate button. We start character by character printing each letter out from the text that's in this text box. Okay, so we want to implement this start feature. Let's take a look at some of the other functions that are here in this file. We have this function already implemented for us. It's called next character. And can somebody tell me, looking at this, there's something I need to do with one of the variables here. If you're just looking at this, the way one of the variables is defined or not defined, what's wrong with this next character function? Okay, index is not defined, right? So this is actually something we want to create as a module global. And that'll be apparent when we get into some of the other functions. But one of the first things we want to do here is set a module global for index, because we want to keep track of where we are in printing out the characters in our input string. So I'm going to go to the top here, and I'm going to do a module global here, let index, I'll start it at 0. Right? So now we're ready for that. And if we just look at this function here, what this does, it gets the value of the what's in that text box, right? So what's in here. And then we have our index if it's greater than the input text dot length. So whatever our text is we put in this input, we can get the length of it by calling using the dot length property. And then if our index is greater than that, we're going to reset the index. But otherwise, we are going to we're going to get the character at this particular index from the input string and append it to what's currently at the output. And what's interesting to note here is that we can actually reference characters, or we can index, we can get the particular character at a certain index by using this array syntax here. And it looks like somebody's noticing an error here. Input text is a string, so why isn't it input text.length? I think you are very correct here. Ooh. This is actually not a function here. So we're going to use the length property of our string here to reference the length. Now, let's see exactly what this function is doing. So I'm just going to copy this function out here, and I'm going to put this in the console. And I'm going to set a module global here, index equals 0, just in the console. And I'm going to call next character. ID is not defined. Let's define that as well. OK, so now if I call next character, you can see that I print out undefined here, because I actually am referencing, I have no value here in my text input. So I'll actually get the value undefined, and that will print to the screen here. If I put anything here and call next character, so I need to redefine these functions here. Not the most elegant. OK, let's try this again. OK, so next character, I get the H. If I call next character again, I get the E. And you can get the idea that this automatically goes through and just prints each character in our string and just repeats. OK, so now that we see that, we want to basically call that function next character. But we want to do this with a certain delay here. So can somebody just give me a timer length here that I want to do? How would I start a timer here to call next character? What would that line of code be if I wanted to continuously call next character? Okay, so I'm seeing set interval, and I'm also seeing set timeout. So if I use set timeout, what would happen is I would only call my next character function once. So if I want to keep calling next character, I need to use set interval. And so here I can pass in next character, and then we can just set a certain amount of time, say 200 milliseconds. And now if I type in here and hit start, this does work as expected and just keeps repeatedly printing out, does this work character by character? OK. And yes, Nikhil, we could implement set timeout using either nested set timeouts, recursive set timeouts, or by using a while loop. But then we might need to have a reference or like actually access our index and access the length of our string and our text box, similar to what next character is doing. So to sort of like avoid having to do that again, we can simply use set interval here, like so on line 25. And as we can see here, this is just going to keep going. So I'm going to reload the page there. So once we do this, once we want to stop this, if I want this to stop, I want to be able to click reset and have this stop outputting to the screen. And so here, I can just empty out these values. So I'll do query selector input dot value equals empty string. I'll do ID output dot text content equals empty string. So let's try this. OK, but now obviously I still need to clear my interval. So what I can do here is call clear interval. But once again, as we saw with the Skittles example, what am I missing from this interval? Right, we need a timer ID. So back up here, I want to set this to a timer ID. But if I do this way, how can I access the timer ID from this function? Right, yeah, so we need this to be a module global. So I'll set the timer ID there, and I'll go up to the top, and I'll do let timer ID. We'll call it null. And now if I go here, I have my timer ID, and then in reset, I clear the interval by hitting timer ID. And now hope this works. And if I reset, that gives us the expected behavior. So we're at time for today. I'll stick around and answer some questions. Fitz and I also have office hours right after, so we'd love to see you all there. But